Sí, voy a...
¿Lo quiere decir desde allá?
Sí.
Perfecto.
Sí. Muy buenas tardes. Muchas gracias por su presencia aquí en este extraordinario recinto. Es un gran gusto y un verdadero honor.
Oh, I should put it on. Good idea.
Decía que muy buenas tardes, bienvenidos, muchas gracias por estar aquí.
It's fine.
No, not really. Yeah. Okay, now it's.
Es un verdadero gusto y un gran honor tener esta noche en la Universidad de Guadalajara al profesor Andrew Arato, para quien pido un aplauso, si son tan amables. Muchas gracias, y particularmente tenerlo en este recinto, aula magna, que guarda los murales de José Clemente Orozco, constructor cultural del México postrevolucionario. Orozco también dejó parte de su obra en el edificio principal de la New School for Social Research de Nueva York, universidad en la que Andrew Arato es profesor de teoría social y política. La obra de Orozco, dejada en la New School, se llama La Mesa de la Hermandad Universal, y en ella se muestra personajes como Gandhi, Lenin y Felipe Carrillo Puerto, además de personajes representativos de distintas etnias, entre ellas un indígena mexicano. Andrew Arato nació el 22 de julio de 1944 en Budapest, Hungría. Es actualmente profesor de Ciencia Política, de Teoría Política y Teoría Social en el Departamento de Sociología de la New School for Social Research. El profesor Arato obtuvo su licenciatura en Historia en el Queens College de la Universidad de la Ciudad de Nueva York y después se trasladó a la ciudad de Chicago, en donde donde obtuvo el título de maestro con dos papers, uno sobre la historia y la teoría de la primera ley de Newton y otro sobre Erasmo y Lutero y el problema de la libertad, enfocándose también en el estudio de historia de la ciencia, el Renacimiento y la Reforma del siglo XVI. En junio de 1975, a los 31 años de edad, obtuvo el título de doctor en filosofía, pero de doctor en historia por la misma Universidad de Chicago, con una disertación, con una tesis titulada La filosofía y la teoría social del joven Lukács, 1910-1923. Sus lectores fueron Leonard Krieger, Gerhard Meyer y William McNeill. Durante sus estudios de doctorado, sus intereses académicos se enfocaron en el pensamiento marxista, la historia intelectual del siglo XX y la historia de Europa Oriental. Debo señalar que el profesor Andrew Arato emigró a los Estados Unidos en el año 56, a la edad de 12 años, en el contexto de la Revolución húngara, que fue aplastada por el régimen soviético. Pero el profesor Arato transitó de la historia a la teoría política. A partir de sus intereses en Lukács, se convirtió en un exponente o por lo menos en un divulgador, en un comentador de la llamada teoría crítica. Tiene un Reader, una antología de los pensadores de la Escuela de Frankfurt. Y el profesor Arato desarrolló, como les decía, una transición de la historia a la teoría política, pero después transitó del marxismo y del neomarxismo a la teoría de la sociedad civil. Y podríamos decir que la evolución de su pensamiento ha acompañado la evolución del campo político en el siglo XX, europeo y global. Después del tránsito de la teoría neomarxista a la teoría democrática y la teoría de la sociedad civil, realizó otro tránsito de la teoría democrática y de la sociedad civil al constitucionalismo y la teoría legal. Y actualmente él se encuentra en este ámbito de estudios y ahora, bueno, nos va a ofrecer su pensamiento sobre democracia, populismo y constitucionalismo. En los últimos años, el profesor Arato ha sido consultado por el Departamento de Estado de los Estados Unidos, pero también por otras naciones, y ha participado en diversos procesos de creación de nuevas constituciones. Yo, si tuviera que caracterizar al profesor Arato, tendría que decir que es un hombre que ama el conocimiento y el análisis, la discusión y la deliberación. Su mente a veces transita o camina más rápido que las palabras y uno tiene que estar muy atento a atrapar los pensamientos siempre creativos, siempre transgresores que surcan los laberintos de su mente. También tendría que decir que el profesor Arato cree firmemente en el papel de la acción humana como aspecto fundamental de la construcción de la historia, que cree que la historia no es algo predeterminado, sino algo sujeto y abierto a la praxis humana y social, y que el peor servicio que se le puede prestar a los proyectos emancipatorios es casarse con dogmas y abandonar la crítica. Además, debo señalar que uno aprende de Andrew Arato simplemente por estar en el aula de clases escuchándolo. Es de esos profesores cuya personalidad intelectual constituyen en sí mismas una experiencia de aprendizaje. Así que, pues, escuchemos y disfrutemos de la inteligencia y la sagacidad intelectual y el compromiso político del profesor Andrew Arato. Bienvenido y adelante. Gracias.
Thank you very much for very kind words. This will have to be in English, even though, as my friends know, I'm actually undertaking a program of trying to learn Spanish. I'm not there yet. In fact, I'm very far away from being able to coherently speak about a subject matter as important as this one. I taught a seminar which was kindly organized by Héctor, Raúl, Solís, to whom I'm very grateful for inviting me to this beautiful hall. I already gave a presentation on the problem of populism. And as my friends know, for 1 or 2 days, I was worried about repeating what I already said because I felt I said pretty much what I had to say. And even though we expected, and we were right, a much larger group here, we knew that there would be some people, and I was worried about, telling them the same thing twice. It just doesn't seem like a great idea. And I was rescued this morning when I woke up and I looked in my iPad for the New York Times. I was rescued by Mr. Enrique Krause, who today published a piece in the New York Times. I don't know where it appeared in Spanish, but published a piece in the New York Times with the question, "The End of Mexican Democracy?" Which then, of course, made me really think. I don't know the gentleman, although I did read his biography of Power, and I thought it was an extremely interesting reconstruction of Mexican history. Of course, I have no idea what you think of him, but I don't know what is in his mind. But I assume that what is in his mind is our topic, and that he is actually thinking about the specter of populism, which, as I think everyone here now knows, is not obviously just a Mexican problem. It was just a matter of Mexico and Mr. López Obrador. I'm almost no one, I think, today will talk about the end of democracy, question mark. It seems like an incredible exaggeration. Where does such a great fear come from? But if you look at internationally, of course, you really do see in lots of places leaderships which in some respects probably resemble him, and movements too, which have already diminished and in some cases even seriously endangered the existence of political democracy. My own country, Hungary, is one of these places, and as always, the phenomenon can be associated with a single person, Viktor Orban in the Hungarian case, or Orban Viktor, as we say in Hungarian. In Poland, it's Lech Kaczynski, Vladimir Putin in Russia, Maduro in Venezuela, and even in the United States, my second country, people really do speak about the Trump phenomenon under the same heading. And so it's an international specter. If you wanted to rewrite the Communist Manifesto today, I doubt that anybody except the most doctrinaire Marxists would speak about the specter of communism haunting mankind. The specter of populism, I think it's worthwhile to speak about because, in even more countries than I have mentioned, countries of Western Europe, we have just seen in Italy, Philippines, furthest to Asia, something of this phenomenon, and I haven't defined it yet, seems to be at work, and having a problematic relationship, at the very least, to political democracy. So in order to make sense of this, I thought I would follow the following strategy, and I don't want to speak more than 40 minutes, so I'm trying to watch my time. I'll try to define the phenomenon of populism in such a way that these diverse historical and contemporary processes can be brought to a single, brought under a single heading. I'll speak about the diverse histories of the phenomenon, some, but the weight of this lecture, as the title of course indicated, is the relationship of populism to civil society and constitutionalism. That's where I will go next, talk about the problem of civil society and populism, and then end with the discussion of populism and the Constitution. So what is populism? In the United States, this discussion is very difficult to have because in the United States there was a movement that actually called itself populist at the end of the 19th century. And certainly the contemporary context to which I already referred resembled that set of events only vaguely, or that movement only vaguely. The strategy I follow is to, and I've followed this in the past, Héctor Raúl was kind enough to refer to my relationship to critical theory. The strategy I follow is to try to take the best theory that is available and try to use that for a definition. And Ernesto Laclau's populist reason, I think, by far is the best single treatment of populism, as probably you will see. His attitude to the phenomenon is positive and supportive, whereas mine is largely negative, but that does not mean that I cannot use his definition. And these are the parts of his definition. Populism represents a political phenomenon in which a part of society is represented as the embodiment of popular sovereignty. Ever since the invention of the concept of popular sovereignty, of course, the question is, who is the people? How can we define them? How to understand a category of of a single actor in the context of a complex society. Populism, and not only populism, the definition has more than just one part, operates by always finding a part which is the genuine or the authentic part of the people that actually stands for the whole. You see this argument already in Marx in 1843 when he referred to the bourgeois revolution in these terms. And as I said, populism is not the only political movement or project that uses a part-whole logic. But it is different than others because it also constructs the relationship of this part to the other parts in terms of what should be called, in the language of the German theorist Carl Schmitt, a friend and enemy relationship. Laclau calls this the frontier of antagonism, but that's a very polite way of papering over something which is really quite a violent way of conceiving the fundamental social relationship. Friend-enemy relation where there is not just a political, but even existential struggle between the part and the other parts, who are not, of course, in spite of the fact that they belong to the population, genuine parts of the people. The definition further includes the idea that embodiment of the popular sovereign is a double process. A part embodies the whole, but the part is almost always too large itself, and it is not ever unified. As you know, in any movement, if you study any movement empirically, there are always factional conflicts, there are always oppositions, there are always purges, and so on, in especially radical movements. Populism, almost without exception, as I said, has a double structure of identification where the part embodies the whole and a leader embodies the part. And you can look at the phenomenon, and I already mentioned this around the globe, and even historically, there's always a very strong one-person leadership. It can occasionally be a group, but almost always that breaks down. The so-called collegial leadership in history of communism almost always winds up being one-person leadership. Khrushchev, in his famous speech against Stalin, introduces the idea of collegial leadership, but pretty soon he becomes the leader, and you can speak about Khrushchevism or Brezhnevism in the context of the Soviet Union. Elsewhere, too, the phenomenon has this kind of single-person leadership built into it. Finally, in order to create even the unity of the part, a single-person leadership is enough. One also needs some kind of doctrine or some kind of conception. Laclau calls this constructing a chain of equivalences, by which he means taking heterogeneous demands in society and bringing them to a single common denominator where these various demands and injuries and claims can be seen in terms of one or two or three fundamental issues. So for me, populism has all these elements, and in that sense, things that are called populism in different places do not always qualify. If they are missing all these components, we'll say something about the Mexican problem of populism in a few seconds. But a definition, obviously, of a complex phenomenon like that should not be overly reductive, and in fact, we have to see the phenomenon in terms of two aspects that further qualify it. One is a variety of populisms in the plural, and the other one is the stages of populist movements. The variety is most obviously that of left and right. I mean, it's hard to really identify, if you look at the content of what they are saying, Chavismo with the ideology of the National Front in France. There are great differences, obviously, between them. One way of that different interpreters have seen that difference is the construction of the enemy. In the case of what generally is understood as left populism in many Latin American countries, the enemy is the elite. Elite that may control the means of production, the means of knowledge, the political system, the oligarchy the mafia, as it is now called here. And left-wing populism generally is satisfied with that conception of the enemy, although there is the additional aspect of linking that enemy to a foreign power, as Perón and Chavez and many others have also done, and perhaps not unjustly. Right-wing populism also has another enemy, though, and that enemy is almost always some kind of underclass. It can be a political stratum, it can be a race, it can be a religious grouping. It cannot even be now, and in the contemporary context, most often than not, are immigrants and refugees who find themselves within the national borders. Right-wing populism always has this kind of enemy. The two populisms, nonetheless, are united in their concentration on the elite, because even right-wing populism thinks of an alliance between the elite and the underclass. As you have seen, for example, in US-American discussions, the enemy, the liberal elite, is linked up to either in the past, this was the emphasis, African Americans as a racial group whom they defend and whom they try to improve their conditions at the expense of what was always understood as a white majority. Today, immigrants play that kind of role. The elite is understood as having to, as opening the borders or opening them too much, and in that sense favoring the immigrant over the true U.S. Americans. So this distinction between left and right populism is relevant, although I want to add, and I'll return to this, it's not enough to identify the variety in the phenomenon. Populism, as I defined it, is a kind of ideology, but it is a very weak and thin ideology, and in almost every setting it needs some kind of crutch, some other ideology which it also is built upon. And historically, many ideologies can play that role. For left populisms, it's mostly a version of socialism. For right populisms, it's mostly a version of nationalism, though, as you probably know from your history too, these things can be combined. Nationalism and socialism can be used together. Religion, in some settings, in the U.S., the Tea Party certainly was strongly linked to evangelical Protestantism, and it can be in other settings, Catholicism that plays that role, or even in other countries, Islam, as in Turkey, for example, for Erdogan. All religions, in principle, can play that role. And finally, even democracy can play this role as a host ideology. In fact, it does for almost every contemporary populisms, which claim, and Ernesto Laclau's claim is this, claim themselves to be democratic. In fact, they're the only true democracy from the point of view of the populist, but it is a version of democracy that reduces democratic politics to elections only and to majority rule. So once you get elected, you should be able to do anything and not be restricted by checks and balances, by constitutional structures. This kind of democracy is liked by many populists, perhaps not in an authentic way, but at least instrumentally. Finally, dealing with the issue of definition, I will just mention this because obviously I'm going on a little longer than I thought in terms of the subtopics. Populism can have stages, and in lots of settings we see it as a movement in society which satisfies my definition, but does not mean that populism would be understood, as Krause just wrote, the end of Mexican democracy. Even a right-wing movement or a radical left movement that exists in society need not threaten the institutional framework. But of course, and this is neglected by a lot of the authors who have written on populism, sometimes the movement actually can form a party successfully and contest elections successfully and even win. And in that case, populism enters into government. There are populist governments. The ones I mentioned so far, well, not all of them. The National Front has never formed government in France, or Alternative for Germany has not formed government. but the names I mentioned indicate names of presidents and prime ministers who have successfully formed government. So populism can also be a form of government. And I would say also, although this has been rarely realized, I'll mention the one case where apparently it has been, populism it can also be a regime in the sense that not only are populist leaders elected to political power and responsibility, but they use that power to transform the political regime in such a way, generally in such a way that they remain in power for an extended period, potentially for a very long time. So populism can also be a regime, at least in theory, and sometimes you discover this to be the aim. I said that the next issue I will talk about is history. I don't want to talk about this much, although I do want to have this dimension because of Mexico, which represents a very specific case in the history of populisms. A good friend of mine, a fellow New School professor, Federico Finkelstein, has written extensively on populism, and his thesis is that populism is what happens when fascism is impossible. In other words, when you cannot create a fascist movement and cannot take power in a way that Mussolini or Franco or Hitler took power primarily through extra-legal or at least dubiously legal means in a revolutionary process, actually. When you cannot have that, populism becomes a substitute. And you can imagine, did I say that he was from Argentina? I guess I didn't, but that's quite important here because he really has the Argentine case in mind. Perón was clearly an admirer of Mussolini, and in the end constructed something that really is quite different historically than historical fascism. And created, I think, perhaps a version of populism which is still around. So populism in Federico's mind is a kind of fascism, an ersatz fascism, a substitute fascism. It's a very polemical way of looking at the phenomenon. I'm sure that none of you like it here because it seems to have nothing to do with Mexican reality. But I mention it in order to introduce Mexican reality because given a broader history that doesn't really just fixate on Argentina, one can also see, at the very least, populism has also emerged from the socialist tradition. Ernesto Laclau himself was a good Marxist militant all his life. Although very young, he was part of the Peronist left, but most of his life he was on the Marxist left. And his turn to populism occurred at a time when he became quite skeptical, I think for pretty good analytical reasons, of the theory of historical progress as Marxists had it, of the revolutionary proletariats taking power, and so for him then populism became what you can have if you cannot have a Marxist radical project or Marxist revolution. Now, even this combination doesn't seem to fit your country. I learned this in Alberto Olvera's very interesting presentation yesterday, where he actually dealt with Mexican history and pointed to the fact that in the 1930s, under the presidency of Lázaro Cárdenas, Mexico has indeed not only had in power a populist government, but actually constructed a new regime type. An interesting new regime type. You all know it much better, obviously, than I could possibly know it. But he mentioned, at least Alberto, the elements of corporatism, inclusion of the various social strata, but not under the heading of the one, but under the heading of three. Quite an original creation historically, although at the time there were other experiments in that direction. The synthesis also involved a kind of appeal to nationalism, which had the element of the socialisms of the type of nationalizing the commanding heights of the economy. Lots of evolutionary socialists by that time in Europe, for example, were not thinking of abolition of private property in general, but the commanding heights, it's Lenin's phrase, have to be occupied by the state. And indeed, this also happened in the Mexican case. Correct me if I'm wrong about this, because obviously I'm not a specialist in Mexican history. And the third element was a constitutional element, which actually weakens my definition, because instead of the personalism of the single leader who stays in power, you invented, it's a wonderful invention, it doesn't exist anymore, but it existed until 1990, a kind of presidentialism where the president stays in power, very great power, controls everything for one term. His last important act, and we have to say his because you never had a she, his last important act is picking the successor. And after that, I was published by Fondo Cultura Económica, and I had a chance to visit Mr. de la Madrid. Well, you become the president of an important publishing firm or some other thing. So you don't lose your social status and your importance. But certainly I'm sure that from over there, from his office at Fondo, he was no longer running the Mexican state. Although who knows? Calles, I think, still tried, right, in that historical period not to be president and still, but I don't think he succeeded either. So you invented, or your forefathers invented, a particular institutional device which allows you to have populism, but without the deformations, the irrationalism which is involved in a person staying in power for more than one term. I mean, in the United States, all of us are totally frightened of the possibility that there will be a second term. And usually these second terms, or third terms, or fourth terms are a great problem almost anywhere. Well, you have figured out a way of avoiding it. But the important thing is that, for me, is that although today we cannot find an example of a populist regime, in Mexico you had something like that historically. And once you had it, the phenomenon changes. It must change, because today someone who represents a kind of leadership which I just described has to look back to the history and has to claim in some sense to return to it, and I think that's part of what not just the current presidential aspirant, but also his populist forerunner, Mr. Cardenas, also had a tendency to look back to the past. So in that sense, a backward-looking model becomes part of populism. I didn't define it that way because in lots of settings you have no historical populism of that kind to look back to. But I think it alters the phenomenon when you have it, maybe constrains it also. But what I wanted to speak about is a different kind of constraint, as the title indicates, namely the constraints involved in civil society and constitutionalism, which are serious constraints, but they also represent part of the potential threat. Now, I don't want to review the conception of civil society that I developed together with Gene Cohen many years ago now, but certainly civil society, as is broadly understood today, not by Marx yet, but already Gramsci heading in that direction, is a domain different than the economy and the domain of politics proper. It consists of networks of associations, initiatives, cultures, forms of life, which are brought together almost always in a kind of public sphere, where a kind of pre-political politics, sometimes even anti-political politics, occurs. And in this sense, aside from totalitarian regimes, there are civil societies everywhere in modern societies. They, of course, will be quite different depending on different specific traditions, different cultures. But I think in almost every civil society, the option for a populism as a movement to emerge exists. And one can see this studying social movements. I just give one example. One very famous one, which has perhaps the best name, is the Solidarity movement in Poland, which played such an important role in the 1980s and indeed played a role in a much more global phenomenon of ending the communist regimes. Those who examine it from the outset, like, for example, Alain Tourain's group, but I did it too, roughly the same time in the 1980s, saw that this movement has both a side which is pragmatic, ready to negotiate, recognizes social plurality, and has a side which understands the working class as the embodiment of the nation, and understood even the leader, Mr. Valença, as the person who can really speak not just for the workers, but for the nation as a whole. You find this in this duality in many social movements, and it may be productive because it gives the energy of the movement, bringing different people together. But it is the possibility, it represents the possibility, and it actually did occur in the Polish case, of the movement eventually achieving political power, and in that case, the fundamentalist part of the movement playing the dominant role. So, in the context of civil society, the possibility for populist politics exists, and I think it would destroy democracy and destroy social freedom for anyone to try to destroy that possibility, to eliminate formations understood as undemocratic. This is sometimes done in the case of political parties. In some countries, you can actually repress and suppress political parties that are understood as not democratic. This is called militant democracy in some settings. But no one has actually created such a system with respect to civil society, and nor should the experiment be tried. But this, of course, means that the possibility of an anti-democratic movement emerging from society is always present, and this is part of democratic society to actually provide, to admit that possibility. Now, when a populist movement comes to power, in a sense of forming a government, I won't talk about much populist regimes because there are not too many examples of that historically, then the conflict between civil society and populism really finally emerges. It existed before. There can be harsh debates and even sometimes violence between social movements and initiatives, but once a populist movement is in power, on a basis of the conception which many of them share and which I illustrated in terms of my definition, other groups in civil society become enemies. I mean, if you believe that you can speak for the nation as a whole and a leader can speak for you, why should somebody attack that leadership in violent terms, bring it down, and try to make it impossible for such leaders or such groups to accomplish anything? The friend-enemy relationship starts as a struggle against the elite, but by the time, and you see this, for example, in Venezuela now, by the time a populist regime, a populist government is formed, and certainly if you actually have a populist regime, former friends or former opponents also become violent enemies. Of course, the converse also applies, is that civil society activity, whether of the press or of associations or of new forms of mobilization, represent attempts to save democracy even in the context of a populist government. You can have a populist president, like the United States I think currently does. You can even have a populist government, but it doesn't mean that you have been able to suppress all the freedoms that the previous liberal democratic society implied. You will run into difficulty realizing your program, but that difficulty, those difficulties can be overcome only if a populist regime can be constructed, and as I said, that has not yet been successful. But it's a threat. I mean, in a way, the Krause piece jumps over one of the stages I just mentioned, There is a populist movement. It now is expressed as a political party in Mexico. He's imagining eventually a populist regime. It would take a lot in Mexico to go from A to C, but in some ways, the logic of populism allows one to think it, and that is because of the fundamental differences between civil society and populism. Populism, as I defined it, and as you can see it now historically, does not accept the idea of self-limitation, does not accept plurality, and does not accept the fact that social movements should influence power without directly exercising it. Those are the characteristics, though, of civil associations, whether they are political or religious or cultural. So, in that sense, the existence of movements and challenges coming from civil society always represent a threat. The threat is serious, though, on a level of, and this is my last topic, a level of constitutionalism. Because let's assume that you have, and I don't want to talk about López Obrador because I really don't know the Mexican case, but let's assume you have a populist government here which has, to some extent, the teleology or the logic which I described. And let's assume that, for example, as in some countries, a church, whether the Catholics or the Protestants, challenge it. It could easily happen because there are always, as you know from Mexican history, fundamental issues which divide secular politicians and politics from the aspirations of churches. Well, one could take the position, let them talk, let them say what they want to say, as long as they themselves cannot create a political movement that could actually bring us down. But more immediate is the problem of constitutionalism, because whereas churches that can be socially very powerful cannot directly change political decision-making, in lots of countries, and Mexico in this respect may be different, in lots of countries, courts represent a really fundamental difficulty for populist rulers. You've seen in the case of already the first year of Trump, how could you not pay attention to it, since the issue had to do mostly with immigration and the existence of immigrants on U.S. soil. The courts continued to stop the attempts of the government to change the status, to change the form of administration of populations that were either coming in or were already there in the United States, and which, from the point of view of populist leadership, represented a severe danger. Of course, it's a ridiculous idea, but the followers of the leader did believe it, and the leader continued to repeat the point. But he could not accomplish the task, and even now, the case is now brought against California in the federal courts, because California refuses to give up its right of sanctuary for immigrants. And there's a good chance, I don't want to predict, that the federal courts which have stopped repressive measures before will do so again. So, of course, the court in some respects is an enemy, and it's an immediate enemy in a way that a church or some civil association, American Civil Liberties Union or whatever, is an enemy, but it is not an enemy that represents an immediate blockage on policymaking. But courts, in countries where there are strong apex courts, strong constitutional or supreme courts, I'm not sure if your courts are that strong. Historically, certainly they were not. But certainly in many countries, whether in Eastern Europe or now in the United States, Russia was also, this was also true. Turkey there was an interesting and long-term battle of then Prime Minister Erdogan, now President with the courts. The courts represent a real problem, and one has to deal with them. And this is, in principle, easy because the courts are understood as elites, just jurists who do not have themselves a social base. And almost everywhere, they're under attack. But sometimes there are other features of the constitutional system: the independence of the legislature, the freedom of the press, which is strongly guaranteed and is well established, which represent threats to a populist government. Think about, for a moment, as a thought experiment, again, I don't want to really comment on Mexican affairs, but let's assume that Mr. López Obrador wins the election as it now looks, and then try to look at the overall political picture, right? Namely, courts, which I'm not sure how strong they are in Mexico, but they exist in any case. And then there is a legislature. And then finally, federalism. So this is a country now, after 1990, with great many constitutional institutions which are provided for by the 1970 Constitution, as it has been amended many times over. And indeed, with the end of the hegemony of the PRI, these institutions have, if anything, become potentially stronger. You don't really have a very strong form of presidential government anymore, as many people, including Alberto Olvera, has explained it. So what does a populist leadership do in a setting like that? If it is already has the executive power, but that executive is weak, it will confront these other institutions, and you have quite a lot of them. You have the state governments, the governors, you have the courts, and most importantly, you have parliament, which is the first step in order to bring the others under control. That's what you really have to control. And a party which has perhaps 10% of the parliamentary seats, I'm not predicting anything, or 20%, would have a very tough time in bringing parliament under control. Now, again, I don't want to engage in futurology. I just want to say what are the choices of a populist regime at a time like that. Certainly, with respect to the courts, we already know that in every single instance, the populist regimes, when the courts block them, try to pack the highest courts, in other words, name new members. They reduce the jurisdiction of courts. They change the voting rule, and one can show this across the board. I don't know if this is a relevant issue in Mexico, because it depends on how much threat the courts represent. But what do you do with parliament? And we know the answer, at least from some settings. Venezuela would be a good case. What you do, and Venezuela, astonishingly, it's happening twice, as Marx said, the first time tragedy and the second time as farce. You create a new constitution. I mean, if the constitutional structure represents a limit on what executive power can accomplish, how about creating a new constitution? And actually, in almost any setting, making a new constitution may not be such a bad idea. For example, in the United States, we sometimes talk about this, because what does it mean that there is the filibuster in the Senate and a relatively few representatives can block governmental policy? What is the Electoral College, where you can lose an election and be elected president? So, the idea of a new constitution, even in the United States, which has a constitution from 1787, is not an irrelevant matter. And in Mexico, too. I mean, you had something like a regime change, or at least a transition to democracy in the 90s, and yet you're doing it on the basis of amending like an old suit of clothes, putting new spots and new sewing up here, sewing up there. You're amending the Constitution, but a new Constitution would make sense in a setting like this, abstractly. I have no opinion about what I would change and what I would keep. Obviously, some things you would change and other things you would keep. For example, I think that the budgetary powers of the states ought to be very much strengthened if you want to reduce centralism and create more political autonomy. But I don't want to take a stand on that. A populist leadership might bring up issues which are really wrong with the Constitution, but its interest will be, in fact, to produce one which will be good for it. So, I mean, one thing is for sure, and you can swear on a stack of Bibles, if Mr. Lopez Obrador is president and he is engaged in a constitution-making process, the non-re-eligibility of the president is not going to stay the way it is now, right? I mean, the first and most important matter to him, as well as it was to Chavez or Uribe, it can be on the left, it can be on the right, Erdogan, Orban, and so on, is re-eligibility, to be able to be re-elected. You can't accomplish what you have promised, all the different things you promised to different people in one term. Are you going to create end of corruption and security in Mexico in one presidential term? No, I need at least 4. I mean, this would be a natural thing for him to think. And this will be perhaps one of the main motives even for constitutional change. But the other will be to try to create a structure within which the executive has much greater freedom of action. Well, that brings me to the end, because that means that not just constitution is under threat, but constitutionalism. I guess I called it constitutionalism. I think populism creates, ever since Peron, this has been the case. Orban, Erdogan, and so on are engaged in constitution-making efforts, and only specific political circumstances can keep populist leaders away from tinkering, changing the Constitution. So constitution making on the agenda would imply that constitutionalism would be certainly threatened. And you can look at constitutions made under populist leaderships. Courts become weaker. Parliaments lose a lot of power. Federalism, certainly. You can't speak for the people if 31 governors can also speak for their state peoples. You know, the Jalisco governor speaking for Jalisco. No. I mean, this has to be, obviously, there's only one Mexican people, and that would transcend any of the local peoples. And this would mean, of course, that those who speak for the indigenous also can't really speak for them, because there's only one Mexican people. And so that has to also occur in the same centralized way. So to create a constitution where you can actually deliver on your claim that you can speak for the people is something that one could expect. As I said, I'm not predicting it, because perhaps it would be so difficult to do such a thing in Mexico that it won't even be tried. But the temptation is there, as long as the checks and balances, whether federal or separation of powers based, or even from media exist. So where does resistance come from? And I return to the topic, and I end with that. The resistance, of course, can come from many sources. In some settings, it can even come from abroad. Latin America today, there are international organizations that also monitor and supervise politics in individual countries. As we have seen in the case of the European Union, though, which is much stronger than the OAS, the ability of the European Union to restrain Orban and Kaczynski has been extremely weak, surprisingly so, because the European Union is really economically very strong, and it has institutions that could actually do things, and yet the ability to act against sovereign states is limited. So it has to mostly come from within, and of course that means from civil society. And yet, well, what happens if civil society is already suppressed? I think this is a fundamental difference between populism in government and populism as a regime. In the case of populism as a movement, it is only one of the movements of civil society. In the case of populism in government, this movement is in political power. But there are other movements, initiatives, bodies, and it's only the most radical form of totalitarianism that can abolish all that. But there can be creative ways of reducing that ability. And I think in this sense, your history is a kind of clue that a kind of closed corporatist framework can actually simultaneously organize plurality and at the same time reduce plurality outside of it. I mean, you can't imagine, if you look back at Mexico in the 1930s, no one probably will be able to claim that the three-party arrangement actually represented all the various groupings of Mexican society, the different cultures, the different ethnicities, the different regions. At that time, not yet different religions. Today, you would have actually, well, yes, different religions because you had Catholic and secular, which was quite a significant difference then. Now you have Protestantism too. So, of course, corporatism is a way of having plurality and not having it in such a way that the populist regime is limited in any way. And I think, given the fact that that's what you have had historically, if I were a populist leader here, I would think about somehow playing with arrangements of that type. The idea of repressing in the manner of Putin or even Orban, I mean, in Hungary today, there's no free press at all. This would be a difficult thing to achieve in a country as heterogeneous and as large and as populous as this one. But there can be other arrangements, and I think it would be on the terrain of constitutional politics that there would be attempts to create them. At the same time, those who are affected are in a position to resist until the system has been transformed into a new one, new regime has been created. And it will depend, if such an experiment is made, I don't predict it, but if such an experiment is made, it will depend on civil society whether the authoritarian aspirations are realized. Same as in the United States. I mean, to count on the Republican Party restraining Trump, or even the Democratic Party really successfully doing it by the electoral means, I think is foolhardy. And even the courts, I mentioned them, they'll be changed gradually by a president who is in power. He's able to name many federal judges, and the Supreme Court is already in majority on their side. So to expect either the two parties in that setting or the courts to play a role in blocking authoritarian development is, I think, probably not going to work. It's not. I don't say it's useless, but I don't think that we should count on it. But a country which is as well organized on a local and a functional level, a religious level too, as the United States, the sources of opposition can come from elsewhere. And we can see every day in the U.S. press, I've never seen such a free press in the United States as right now. It's quite fantastic if you read the level of criticism that is available in the press. And of course that happens, the press still wants to sell copy, right? If the population would be not open to that kind of criticism and that type of journalistic challenge, Washington Post and New York Times would change their line, or at least change it to some extent. But the pressures from below are there, as high level of organization in lots of parts of the United States, and in this sense, the combination of civil initiatives and the free press represent the most important roadblock to establishing something like a more authoritarian system in the United States. I think that is true elsewhere too, and let's hope the issue doesn't come to that here, but if it did, I would put my faith in Mexican civil society rather than any of the existing parties. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course, of course.
Muchas gracias. Profesor Arato está en plena disposición de escuchar sus comentarios y preguntas, así que con mucho gusto las podemos recoger. Allá, sí.
Let's start with one or two, one first, and then,
Okay.
How much time do we have?
No, until 8.
An hour?
Yeah. For 50 minutes.
Okay.
Or 30,
So let's do one
whatever.
first.
Bueno, Antes que nada quisiera agradecerle por sus conocimientos que nos ha transmitido. Mi comentario es, al principio nos comentaba sobre cuando un movimiento o un movimiento populista llega al poder, después surgen ciertos conflictos entre grupos que tal vez no piensan igual que los gobernantes, y pueden llegar a haber roces entre ciertos grupos sociales y el gobierno en turno. Entonces, mi pregunta es, en su opinión, ¿cuáles podrían ser los posibles mecanismos que nos permitan mediar ambas posiciones, las posiciones tanto de la diversidad social, de pensamiento social, como entre el gobierno en turno?
Yeah, let me deal with the first few questions individually, and then if you're running out of time, then we can do two, three at a time. Now, that's a really very excellent question. Oh, yeah, I should, because then I'm going to hear you in Spanish in my ear, and that will certainly throw me off. So that was good advice. I have to keep on putting it on, taking it off. But that's an excellent question. You can see my framework is a little bit mechanical, in a sense that you can actually, I could have even pictured it, right? You put civil society and its organizations, associations, movements as kind of a horizontal line, and there may be 10, 20 such things, but of course, some groups are stronger. And then some of them actually form political parties. Historically, probably true in Latin American history too, political parties emerged from parliament. They were clubs of deputies. But as has been explained by Duverger and many others, modern parties emerged from society. So the working class had various forms of self-organization, initiatives, and then working class parties emerged from it. Labour Party in UK, for example, emerged from the unions directly. So there's a horizontal society, there are movements. Some of them, one or two, become political parties, contest elections. You contest election, you can lose. Mostly the new parties that emerge lose. Sometimes the electoral system makes it very difficult for new parties to win. Sometimes in a complicated structure like yours, you can win and lose at the same time. I think Mr. López Obrador will find that out, because he'll win the presidential and he will not, his party, Moreno, right, it's called, is not going to win the parliamentary. But in any case, let's just focus on the executive. You can occupy the executive. And then something that was a movement of civil society, association, right, the whole thing, Moreno, obviously that emerges in part from below, obviously some militants of the other parties might join, becomes the executive. And I think in some settings, coalition governments in other countries are different, but here he would be able to make an executive entirely his own. And so one group that was just a civil group or association or movement became a party, now is the government. But that doesn't mean everything else disappears. So I say that there's a conflict between them. Of course, that conflict exists because of the populist self-understanding, right? If you really just think of yourself as the one part that has to collaborate with other parts, there's no fundamental conflict until it comes to specific issues. But for a populist government, even before the issues arise, there's a conflict, because we are the people. And all of you out there, well, you know, either you're with us, then you are part of the people, or you're against us and you're enemies. Now, I don't want to exaggerate, because it may not happen quite in such a harsh way over here, but that's the tendency. So then your question is, well, how do you reconcile that, right? And, you know, you always have new ideas. And just now during this lecture, I had one idea which was new, based on Alberto Olvera's presentation yesterday, that in Mexico you could develop a unique way of dealing with that. You incorporate some of them and not the others. That's historically, that's how it was done. And of course, everybody's looking, this is a very historical country. They're in a historical room, but Mexican history is everywhere. You know, I'm going down the street of the of the children, the heroic children, and even from U.S. history, I know about that. So your history is everywhere, and certainly the history of the Mexican Revolution, which has accomplished some important changes here, remains in everybody's mind, especially if someone who comes from that milieu. And so that kind of idea would be one way, because then the alternative is a bad one, right? The alternative is either then you give up on your own representative claims, which means that you lose your bases, your mass bases, or on the other hand, you repress and try to move toward a populist regime through a new constitutional process. In history, people invent new things. And I don't think it's a task of theory to sit here and anticipate what new things will be invented by a political community which is as creative as yours. I mean, you have had very interesting historical experiments and have created many institutions and achieved many things historically. So I don't know exactly what they would do, but you have to deal with this problem, because either you give up your populist identity and you claim, or you accomplish a populist quasi-revolution within the system, which requires constitutional change. It might require illegality, because your constitution doesn't allow the calling of a constituent assembly. So you'd have to do what Chavez did, and extra-legally call one. Will the courts permit it? Well, they did in Venezuela. In any case, you have to figure out some way of doing that. Or you can create a new solution, and I think Mexican history points to some other options here. Take the strongest labor union, take the strongest agrarian movement, maybe even take one movement of the indigenous, and bring them in and deal with them politically on a higher level, and then everybody else who still remains outside then is the real enemy. They are just agents of the United States, or the agents of the capitalists, or whoever the mafia is that they now speak about. But you create a kind of tripartite distinction by which there is the executive, there is also those who collaborate in the new system of compromise. I don't want to invent things for him, and hopefully he doesn't listen, because perhaps they didn't think of this yet. But you understand what I'm trying to say, is that there are different ways of historically dealing with the interesting issue you raised, but they must deal with it. Because otherwise, the people who expect something, you elect him, a lot of people expect them to do things. I mean, why is there such enthusiasm around that kind of new leadership? First of all, because the older ones are discredited, but that's just negative. There has to be a lot of optimism of some people. In the case of Trump, there was too. Okay, I don't want to identify Trump and López Obrador, by the way. I mean, this is, I think that would, especially to an audience here, that would seem really beyond the, you called me transgressive. I never realized I was that transgressive, but that would be transgressive. Okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor. It was very interesting. I want to ask you about democracy, actually the case of the Mexican democracy. The translation of democracy comes from Latin, that it means
wait a minute. I'm listening to it in Spanish, and are you speaking English?
Yes.
I'm listening in Spanish, and my 2 courses yet with Babel have not gotten me to the point of actually understanding it. So, yes, sorry, could you start? Because I was trying to understand in Spanish.
I was speaking about the Mexican democracy. I guess many of us have questioned ourselves about the translation of democracy that comes from Latin. That means something like the power of people. Actually, here in Mexico, political parties have represented this democracy construction in Mexico. But I want to know your opinion about if the political parties represent democracy or not, and if they, why? Thank you.
No, it's excellent. I mean, these questions are great. In the other talk 2 days ago, I focused on this kind of point. I guess it was friendlier to populism than this lecture today was. I mean, just things come out the way they come out, and I can't always help it. It was friendlier because I started with saying, what are they addressing? What kind of deficit are they addressing? What kind of problems are they addressing? Are there no problems at all? And I spoke about a democracy deficit, which is inherent in liberal democracy, electoral democracy. I spoke about a welfare deficit, and I even mentioned a status deficit, which may not be relevant in Mexico, but it's very relevant in the United States. In other words, people who feel their status has been dramatically lowered by developments. But the democracy deficit is obvious. Liberal democracy gives a lot of power to elected officials for very long periods of time, and our links to them are not strong. Accountability is not strong through liberal institutions. This, I think, all really serious theories of democracy admit. Some, like Schumpeter, think it's okay to have it this way because you can exchange one elite by the other. But you know, if they're both elites whom you don't identify with, that change does not strike you as particularly significant. And so, in a way, the form of representation that exists in liberal democracy is incomplete and insufficient. I don't know how many people feel that it is a complete sham, but I think, you know, we have seen enough change and enough responsiveness in political democracy historically. The most important of them is the development of welfare states in the Northern and Western European countries. That, yes, political parties do sometimes carry out what they promise their constituencies, and in this sense they are accountable and they do represent. But there's always a lag, and there's always a problem too, because as new needs, new interests emerge, the political parties tend to be historically traditional, and they do not become, they remain vehicles for something that is always in the past. So I think that democracy has to be made more democratic. Populism is right about the problem, but in fact its solution points just in the opposite direction, because instead of being represented by many, you get to be represented by the one. That's a monarchical principle ultimately, right? Now, your president was a kind of monarch, except for the fact that in the old system that he could be president only for the 6 years or a little more. Right? But that idea that one representing all is a monarchical principle. So if parties are not good ways of representing, then representing by the one is even worse. Right? Heterogeneity of society, the parties don't capture it. Right? When was a party that was dedicated to the interests of the indigenous in Mexico, the Zapatistas might say? Right? And you can point to the whole history and say, this was not adequately represented, this need and interest. But if you had only one representative or one group that represented, then things would be even worse. So how do you actually go from the many to the even more? And I think we have to think about democratization of democracy from that point of view. And I think you're quite right in raising the question. But populism, which raises the question, gives, I think, an answer which makes the problem worse, which is why they must move to a regime, because the disappointment becomes clear after a certain point. You know, Putin could say, and of course Chavez too, especially as long as they had enormous amount of oil resource given the oil prices, that we can actually do things for the immense majority. But after a certain point, they can do things for fewer and fewer people. And in this sense, populism, though promises to produce a better form of representation, actually replaces interest representation by symbolic representation. The most interesting book on representation is Hannah Pitkin's book called Representation. I think it illustrates the difference between these different modalities. Symbolic representation is the king. The king is your representative, right? Now, of course, he's not bound in at least a strong version of monarchy to the interests and to the views of his constituency. He knows what that interest is, and he tries to follow it as well as he can. Sometimes monarchs, very seldom, but still it happens, fall over misrepresentation. But political parties, though they represent an improvement, do not represent this sufficient, I mean, that's your point, do not represent a sufficient improvement over the quality of a one-person representation. They can represent interests, but they cannot represent all the interests, and they cannot create a system in which all segments of society can make inputs into the political system. So you need other mechanisms. I think federalism is one mechanism that historically has played a role in this. And I think federalism, in this sense, should be reactivated in most settings where it already exists, or perhaps created where it doesn't exist. But federalism is territorial, and sometimes interests and political constellations are cross-territorial, and so you need forms of representation which also point beyond that. Well, historically, of course, we can point to forms of better representation than just purely through political parties, but I don't think we have a model any place in the world where all the claims of democracy have been fulfilled. Okay.
Hi, so I just want to know if you can go more into depth in this new constitution that you somehow talked about. Like, how would that make a progress into a better or a better represented government? How would a new constitution make an effect?
Well, we're talking about two new constitutions. One is the populist constitution. We have examples of it because in Hungary, Orban has produced a new constitution, Chavez produced a new one, Perón in the early 1950s produced a new one, and you see aspiration to that in Poland. In Turkey, Erdogan has produced a new constitution. To the extent that we can generalize, all these constitutions increase executive power. So they give decree powers to the president or to the, in some cases, in the Hungarian case, to the government. It's a parliamentary regime. But executive power and a weakening of legislative oversight. One interesting thing in Hungary is that the legislature has become smaller, which goes against even what you said, because it means fewer people gain representation, and it meets much less often. So the sessions of the legislature are reduced. Courts are weakened. It's a typical thing that happens in the Turkish, Hungarian, Polish, Russian case. It happens in the Venezuelan case as well. So a weakening of separation of powers, weakening of parliamentary oversight, weakening of federalism. Putin has, one of the things he really did to the Yeltsin constitution was reduce the autonomy of regions, with the central government picking the governance instead of them remaining elected. So the populist constitution moves away from separation of powers, greater executive power, establishes re-eligibility, re-election of presidents. So your question, if it's about what that will look like, I added an element, and I hope you will not quote me, because I don't want to give ideas to populists, that you could add an element of corporatism too, if you wanted to create a synthesis in a society of a tradition like this one. So, of course, we don't really know what a populist constitution will literally look like, but these would be the elements. Now, if you ask me what my constitution would look like, generally speaking, although I participated in constitution making in Hungary, in Nepal, and in Zimbabwe, 3 different parts of the globe, strangely enough, I don't tend to, myself, ever tell anybody, put this in, do this, do that. You know, as I said in the other group, and people didn't know what I meant, that even as a Marxist, I always liked Rosa Luxemburg in German, and not Lenin, in the sense that you learn from the movements and not from, you know, you don't create the new ideas in the head of a powerful central committee, was her expression. So I like to see what emerges in a given setting as a kind of democratic proposal. If the gentleman raises the question, are parties democratic enough? So what are his proposals for direct democracy. How would we introduce element of direct democracy into the system? It's not impossible. How would we make federalism stronger, if that would be one way of making for greater accountability and produce more participation? But I would think that in any case, whereas a corporatist constitution is one that excludes even more people than before in the liberal democratic setting, the goal of democratic constitution making would be to have more inclusion, and not just formal citizenship, that kind of inclusion. I guess in Mexico that would not be a problem today. Everybody is a citizen, which was not true in the oligarchic era. But by inclusion, full inclusion, I mean inclusion of participation by the various structures, the various organs, the various associations and initiatives to create a framework within which laws are made only if there has been proper consultation with those concerned, if there is a possibility for making political inputs on a local level into national decision making, and so on. And of course subsidiarity, in order to actually bring decision making closer to the ground wherever it is possible, would be another component. But I can speak about the populist constitution because there are 4, 5, 6 of them in formation today. To speak about this form of constitutionalism is difficult, although obviously the problem of democracy will be one issue to solve. I think the problem of welfare will also be relevant to this new constitution, because this is especially strong, important issue in the United States. Contemporary capitalist systems very often have either no welfare security for significant parts of the population, as in the United States, or they have very unequal ways of providing for it, as I think probably is the case in Mexico. So an improvement of welfare systems on a constitutional level, which can be accomplished by creating judiciable rights of a broader type than just the liberal rights of free press, free speech, security for property, and so on. So that would be another dimension of this alternative version of constitutionalism. But again, I'm more hesitant in making any proposal, because I think that would be different in different settings, and I think what would be interesting is to actually organize a discussion. If indeed the issue of making a new constitution is ever an issue, then the most important thing is to organize a process by which more creativity, more freedom for proposals, more discussion, more criticism of proposals would be possible. You know, very often constitutions are made by elites who are put in the position of producing any constitution that they want. Mr. Chavez was a master of this, because he concocted an electoral rule by which over 90% of the assembly were his partisans. So basically, he and his team could make any constitution that they wanted. That's not the way to introduce the maximum amount of societal creativity, freedom of proposals, and participation into the process. I think the South African process, from this point of view, is a much better example of what is possible on the level of constitution making. And I think the interesting question would be, let us say, again, hypothetically, I like to play, but of course I don't want to predict any country's future. Let's assume that a new government is elected here, they find the existing constitutional structure to be too much of a constraint, and they wish to change it. And they'll propose that a constituent assembly be elected, whether it is legal or not. Maybe a referendum like in Colombia or Venezuela would be used in order to enable that. The question would then be how you do it. And the most important question is that. You ask what you put into the Constitution, but the prior question is always, who is to do the putting? Who is actually in a position to actually act and to make proposals and to participate and to criticize? And the most important thing about democratic constitution making would be to create as broad a process as possible,
So if he wants to make a constitution, they want to make a constitution, a new constitution, maybe Mexico is ready for it, then the issue is how you do it. And there is the place for a democratic challenge, not necessarily to say, well, we want to keep everything as it is. That's not a winning proposition in a country in which there's so many problems. So yes, let's change things, but how you do it is the most important issue that we all need to discuss. And that cannot be the function of just one government elected by, let us say, you have this plurality electoral system. So you'll elect your president and the executive by 30%, 35% of the vote probably. So should that 35% give Mexico its new constitution? That would be clearly wrong, and yet that's what happens in lots of cases. So I think to be aware of this problem, even if it is only a hypothesis that it will actually be a problem here, I think would be a good idea, because it's very difficult to say on the part of a government, no, I want to organize an elitist, exclusionary constitution-making process. The argument that at least when we give ourselves the fundamental rules, we should do it democratically, is an extremely strong one and very difficult to argue with.
Thank you for your conference. So you mentioned before that if Andres Manuel actually wins the elections, we may never see a president as we see it today. So I think my question is, it will not be the end of democracy, but the start of an authoritarian populism? Thank you.
Well, with respect to Mr. Krause's piece, I didn't start out criticizing him, but of course, in effect, I criticized him because by introducing this three-stage model, he bases his argument pretty much in the Times. You can all look it up, and it's in Spanish somewhere. He bases his argument on 2 or 3 acts of López Obrador, basically. There is not much evidence, really, linked to the person that he would be authoritarian at all. I don't want to defend him. I don't know the gentleman. But, on level of evidence, Krause doesn't produce a lot. And I say that if you're afraid for democracy, at least you should see that as a 3-stage process. There he is. He has a movement. He has put that together. How they operate within that movement would be an interesting question. I don't know the answer. How do they pick their candidates for Congress, for example? That's an interesting empirical question which some of you here could answer. How does Moreno pick its candidates for Congress? The leader of the party could actually check every single candidate, and you cannot become a candidate without López Obrador. No, you say it wasn't done like that. I don't know. I'm just saying that's a possibility. The other one would be a democratic process by which you generate candidates on a grassroots level, and whoever is picked by assemblies, he will live with them. So there already would be more issues to discuss than Krause discussed in that piece, even today, and they're not yet in power. So the next thing is when they are in power. Usually, previous non-democratic practice is a clue that you'll be even less democratic when you're in power. I mean, generally, people do not become more democratic when they're trying to do things, which is always difficult. You tend to actually become more, you can see this also in all the cases that I mentioned. The parties which are populist from a retrospective point of view have not been necessarily very anti-democratic when they operated within civil society and when they competed with other groups for support. But in government, you tend to become, but even that, of course, does not mean the end of Mexican democracy, just because you have a government that actually does things and occasionally questionable things from the point of view of democracy. With Trump, we have dozens of things he has done already. I think to speak about the end of liberal democracy in the US today would be, of course, absurd. So that's another stage, another terrain. But you would see trends, and I think the logic, at least of populist leadership, is to challenge democratic institutions because they all inhibit, especially inhibit in the case of strong disagreement. So that's would be the second stage. And the third stage, what it looks like, no one knows. So I have to be careful, and I don't want to adopt this alarmist, and even Krause puts a question mark at the end of the piece, so he himself does not say it's going to be the end of, you elect this guy, end of Mexican democracy, basta, you're finished. No, he doesn't say that. And of course it's a question mark for him, but it's a question mark where he tries to say it would be seriously endangered. And I say that it would require many steps to endanger it, and there are counter steps possible at all stages. A democracy is not without resources in defending itself. And I think this country certainly is, with its huge cultural differences within it, its regional differences, different relationship to the economy and so on, different forms of associational life, even churches and so on. There will be lots of resources which, and of course Krause tries to strengthen some of those resources. I mean, the intention is, of a piece like that, is to say beware and fight. I don't think he has to be read in a fatalistic way. But I think knowing that there's a problem, I mean, you know, when Chavez came to power and they have enormous resources to distribute, and most of society supported the party, yeah, okay, maybe democracy was weakened in some respects, but social inclusion was increased, social rights, I stress them, have been strengthened, so there are pluses and minuses. And yet today you have a different process, and so in that sense, one has to be aware that populist governments, when in conflictual situations, challenge democracy. And once in a while they are able to form a populist regime.
Good evening. Thank you for your conference. Following up with the last question, there seems to be a growing concern with the potential authoritarian regime that we're seeing with Andrés Manuel and Morena. In your view, or if you can share with us from some cases that you have studied in the past, how can we as civil society act effectively, collectively, to protect or to prevent institutional sequestration or institutional abduction, which is the potential risk to come to?
Yeah, no, I guess because of doing the talk the way I did it today and not starting with the deficits which populism addresses, I didn't give any kind of, I didn't stress the idea that populism is actually very strong. That is, we're not dealing with a phenomenon that exists in some places, but it is relatively easy to deal with. We're dealing with real grievances and real deficits, which they address, and generally speaking, address in effective political ways. So I think in any setting, I can't estimate that in terms of Mexico, how strong it would be. But you know, if you think about even the problem of corruption, which certainly exists here, and was very strong in Russia, was already important phenomenon in other settings where populism was strengthened. If you just think about the problem of corruption, how strongly people hate that, and how much they support politicians and political initiatives that want to bring corruption to an end. Or think about the other problem. I guess I'm sort of gravitating to Mexico, but how can I not when you here? If you think about the problem of security, if someone actually says, we'll do this quite differently than everybody did it before, and we will reestablish security, that's a very powerful idea. So just even security and end of corruption, and perhaps some social issues. I don't know really even the program of Moreno, we will address some social issues, and we will create more, reduce inequality perhaps, which I think is pretty important idea in lots of populist settings. I don't know, if in terms of immigration from the rest of Latin America is an issue here. That would be something in the United States. That would be something people feel really very strongly about. Of course, it is previously more privileged Anglo sector of the population that feels that way. But sometimes even former immigrants feel that the new competitors, the new people coming in represent a threat. So if you have a certain number of issues like that, then you're really dealing with a really powerful challenge. And so in that sense, in this ideal typical way I presented populism, I didn't indicate that this is something that can be very strong and politically, when the old parties are discredited, when there is a lot of corruption associated with them, when they have not dealt with the problem of equality and security, when they allow the health system to become unequal. I mean, all the things you can point to probably here, then people would give a benefit of a doubt to a new kind of leadership, completely new people, having a different program. Maybe they're not as new in reality as they pretend, but they look new and they seem new, and they seem to represent a break with the past. So I think the problem is serious of how you resist. I'm trying to answer you, but I don't want to underestimate the problem. And so in that sense, what actually I think tends to happen, and what is really required, is to keep opposition alive for a certain time, because it's not going to be easy to overcome the threat. You would imagine that you could not have more ignorant people in charge than we have in the United States right now, and the kind of turnover you see in the U.S. government. Every day they lose an important member of the government, and the number of embarrassments associated with that, and yet it's kind of stable. So in that sense, we have to develop a somewhat different sense of time, and not be fatalistic, as Krause seems to be in terms of that question, but at the same time see that self-organization, mobilization, criticism, creating alternatives are time-consuming. Maybe you even have to generate yet another party for democracy, right? Because the idea of just going back to the pre, or even Pan had now 2 chances at the executive. People do not feel that they accomplished much. I could be wrong, right? So probably you need some kind of new constellation, and that of course requires time too. So you both have to kind of check the aspiration, authoritarian aspiration, to the extent that you can, and use time to develop alternatives. And in that time, keep the deficits of the existing regime, whether a moral deficit with corruption, whether political deficit with democracy, a welfare deficit with the systems of security, deficit in you have to keep these things in mind, because these are the things we too must address. We can't just say everything was fine under liberal democracy, such as introduced in 1990, forget about it. No, the issue is, of course, to do much better than the populists are doing in a new democratic frame. So again, this will take time. But I think a society that has so much structure, has so many groups and so many forms of life and opinion as this one, would be able to do this. But I think you have to kind of trust time. Even the populists, right? I mean, he has tried twice. I don't want to, focus so much on this one person. But in any case, to the extent that he represents the possibility of what at least Krause speaks about, well, he has tried twice, didn't succeed. He's persistent, he's trying again. And this is the kind of relations with time we must have too. To think that we can just generate a new civil society-based democratic alternative 5 days after is unrealistic. So we have to rely on what we have. The press is one thing. hopefully, I just don't know the legal situation. The courts could be another. And of course, various forms of mobilization. I think probably state by state. One thing I thought right away when Trump came to power is that we have to think about New York State. And because the New York State governor and the New York State party system is not in very strong position, it happened in California more. But California is 30 million people. It's bigger than most countries, not as big as your country, but it's a pretty big country compared to many Latin American countries too. So do things state by state. I mean, I have no idea how feasible that would be in the way federalism is constructed here. But that would be something to use, because even as a new force has captured political power in Mexico City, it may be that 2 or 3 or 4 states, new forces can actually do the same, yet new forces which have a different ideology and different conception. And I would say that would be another terrain for doing things. Now, how much you can do, of course, depends on the construction of the federal system. But that very construction could be challenged. Okay.
Can I ask?
Of course. Are you going to ask in English or?
No, en español.
Español, okay.
Bueno, creo que ya no tenemos mucho tiempo, pero quiero agradecer, ahora sí, las preguntas, los comentarios han sido extraordinarios.
Oh, I'm not hearing somehow.
Ahora sí, ¿me escuchas?
Now I can. Yeah.
Ok. Agradecer las preguntas, los comentarios que han sido extraordinarios y que han dado pie también a la igualmente extraordinaria respuesta que ha dado Andrew. Me parece que es muy importante lo que aquí se ha dicho. Creo que ciertamente México ha mostrado en toda su crudeza los déficits de la democracia representativa de partidos que tenemos, de estado de bienestar, de seguridad, de paz, de tranquilidad, de rendición de cuentas o accountability y de crecimiento económico, etc. Y por otra parte, creo también que la posibilidad de que llegue al poder un presidente que tendría posiblemente rasgos populistas, pondría también en entredicho probablemente por lo menos las características del sistema político y de las instituciones democráticas que tenemos en el país. Surge la pregunta de por dónde va a caminar, digamos hipotéticamente, si esto sucede, este nuevo orden de cosas, para no llamarlo régimen, populista probablemente, sí por la vía de una reconstrucción de la democracia o por la vía de una exacerbación de los rasgos autoritarios del sistema bajo una suerte de legitimidad populista. Pero esto nos abre al mismo tiempo la posibilidad de repensar nuestras condiciones y posibilidades para construir verdaderamente una democracia. Y la democracia, como dice Andrew, tiene recursos para defenderse. Y creo que uno de los recursos de la democracia para defenderse son los estudiantes de ciencias sociales, ciencias políticas. Que el hecho de que discutamos de esta manera, con tanta apertura, con tanta lucidez, estos asuntos de política democrática, abre una luz de esperanza. Y yo sinceramente me siento muy contento por eso y los quiero felicitar a todos. Pero bueno, no sé, creo que ya no hay mucho tiempo quizás para una última pregunta. No sé, tenemos 5 minutos.
Let me just say something to this, because it's so strange. I'm at a university, and when I sort of enumerate civil society institutions, I don't say the university. And that's just, I don't really know why that is, because, you know, you have, what, 30, 40,000 students here. I mean, this is an enormous block of social organization. I don't know how it's organized. You're the boss. But in any case, you have a lot of organization. You have a lot of ability to develop the public sphere. You make contributions. And occasionally, governments actually recruit people like you and us to do things. And so this is not, not an insignificant milieu. And I think we should take ourselves in that respect seriously, especially because student movements have been really very important agencies in the transformation of democracy. And, we have to be a little careful because we tend to be too critical of the democracy that exists. And of course, when it's challenged, we will say, well, who cares, The parties were bad, so why not just have one party? I don't think any of you say that. But that would be a kind of, or if you had party system is bad, well, we could have corporatism. Why is that? So we have to, in a way, make ourselves also appreciate the democracy that allows us to be exactly here. Because in North Korea, we couldn't be doing this. Now, I don't want to talk about the most totalitarian setting. Even in Russia, it could be more dangerous today. So, the fact that we're doing this already is a result of Mexican democracy, as deficient and inefficient and problematic as it may be in many respects. And so we have to also, to cut the tree or the limb on which we sit, that's an English remark. We should not cut off the limb on which we sit. And now, of course, there will be a conflict of any new attempt at authoritarian solutions, if there is one, with the universities. Because this is one great university, you have other ones in Mexico. And students, generally speaking, I know this from personal experience, don't like authorities to tell them just what to do. They value their freedom. And that's true for faculty too. So I think, you can expect a role for yourselves. And that role can, for a while, be a critical role, an intellectual role. But that has consequences. We're not just talking, although, of course, often that's what happens and there's no result. But it can have political consequences. I think also taking ourselves seriously is important. Yeah. Prego una pregunta. I learned that in my Spanish, in my Spanish lesson, so that I actually understand. O tengo una pregunta.
A menos que ya los traductores ya se fueron. Puedes hablar o acércate aquí. Acércate. O tampoco. Let's do this a democratic experience.
Muchas gracias, Rector.
La última, ¿no?
Señor Andrew, compañeros, compañeras. Yo quisiera retomar un poco el comentario del doctor Héctor Raúl, en el sentido de cuál es la relación entre la teoría y el ejercicio del poder, el papel que tenemos las universidades y con ellas los universitarios para poder impactar o de alguna manera influir en el ejercicio del poder, pensando sobre todo en el constitucionalismo, pero no tanto como la actividad parlamentaria, sino en el ámbito de las ciencias sociales y las humanidades y la reflexión que hay en torno al propio constitucionalismo, ¿no? Hablando desde la sociología, pero sobre todo desde el derecho constitucional, el papel que tienen los juristas, por ejemplo, a la hora de delimitar el poder del Ejecutivo, ¿no? De ese sentido, sí quisiera que nos profundizaran más en términos teóricos y nosotros como estudiantes, las relaciones que vamos a tener a lo largo de nuestra trayectoria como profesionistas de estas áreas y para digamos, retomando un poco lo que decía de las relaciones que hay entre la estructura de poder, entre incluso los populismos y la sociedad civil, entendiendo a los universitarios como parte de esta sociedad civil.
Well, most of us not in law. I'm not a lawyer either, although I work on legal issues. So we, kind of think of constitutionalism as dealing with a relatively narrow set of areas. But I think we have to realize that even the precondition that we're here and talk and discuss means or requires that there's freedom of speech in a society, that we can freely assemble, that we can form groups and associations freely, and that also in terms of personal rights, we're not going to be somehow punished for what we say or what we do in a setting like this. So there are rights of personal freedoms which are also involved in this. Constitutions include these matters. So even in a country where there is no formal written constitution, there are very few left like that, but the United Kingdom still doesn't have one. There is a material constitution, the actual constitutional practice, which provides for these kinds of things. So I think we really have to, on the very first level of things, we have to kind of defend those kinds of freedoms that we have. You know, many of you are too young, but there are a few people who are not, and they probably remember how even in this country, these rights have been achieved gradually. I mean, it's not as if this was, even under the old pre-regime, the most authoritarian regime on earth. Certainly it was not. But things were different, and gradually, as a result of both modernization, as a result of constitutional change, it was possible to achieve these rights. And I think the subsequent democratization of Mexico, such as it was, and incomplete and deficient it might have been, was based on these things. I think we have to now probably extend our conception of constitutionalism beyond these matters. I just mentioned one thing. I mean, I doubt that many of you think that courts are particularly important parts of a democratic setup. At the same time, in conversations with many of you, you tell me things like, well, it's only a very small percentage of those who commit any crime are ever charged here, and even a smaller percentage is convicted. So on the one side, public security is weak. Everybody feels under some conditions threatened. At the same time, one of the conditions that would require greater security is not satisfied, because after all, there has to be a system of enforcement of law and of security if the ordinary citizens to feel secure. So here is an interesting test. At least my prediction is that the movement led by Mr. López Obrador is not in love with the courts. Populist leaders anticipate problems with courts, and courts are not ways of extending their ability to act freely. And yet, it may be that he and his government will raise the question of constitutional change. So how many of you will actually think that one of the things that should be strengthened in Mexico is the courts, the rule of law? I mean, that's not what we automatically, especially, students are pretty radical, and courts are not, they seem to be an elitist matter. Maybe law students take them more seriously, but in general, that's not the thing that we focus on. And yet, the battle of authoritarianism, the first battle, as I already argued before, can come with the rule of law and the courts. So strengthening of courts could be an extremely important device, which is not going to be easy in a setting if there is a government that has a populist self-conception. So beyond the rights which you will be able to exercise, I don't think anybody is going to attack the universities in terms of freedom of speech or freedom of assembly here. But to the extent that you want to see rights and the world of rights extended, one area of interest ought to be the rule of law in a much more general sense than just what pertains to the life of the university. And there are many other such areas. I don't want to talk, and I think we have to end. But I think that the horizon that that especially a radical student milieu has to be extended when it's the question of democracy. And I think that one area which is of vital importance to the ordinary person out there, to your parents and your members of your family and the people they know and all the rest, is the rule of law, and that is something that probably is going to be not the first priority of your next government. So it would depend on people demanding the rule of law and stronger courts and better enforcement, and that's something that I think could be extremely popular outside the framework of the university also.
Muchísimas gracias. Pues el tiempo se terminó, pero pues quedamos invitados para cuando vuelva a Guadalajara Andrew. Estamos trabajando en la posibilidad de que haga una estancia corta en Guadalajara próximamente. So I am saying that you will come probably here for a visiting.
Well, it's not my first time.
Oh, no.
Not my first time, and actually it's my fourth or fifth time in Guadalajara, and so of course it would be the greatest pleasure to be able to come back.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Entonces, pues muchas gracias a todos. Gracias al rector general que nos facilitó el Paraninfo, a Melissa Mezco, a la coordinadora de la maestría en Ciencia Política, Mariana Mejía, a los profesores, jefe del Departamento de Estudios Políticos, a Fernanda por su presencia y a todos ustedes. Y bueno, esperemos que el proceso electoral sea un avance en la consolidación de la democracia mexicana. Gracias y buenas noches.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks a lot.